When I was 5, I saw a conductor in a bandstand in the park. I was too small to see the orchestra beyond the audience, and so thought that all the music came out of the conductor's stick. I was so excited by this conductor's stick that a friend of my mother's bought me one. I immediately started conducting and was bitterly disappointed when nothing happened. I thought, oh no, you've got to learn this. Then someone told me that it was the orchestra that produces the sound and not the stick.
A man like Hans Keller established standards of listening, of interpretation, of listening intelligently for the public and for the musician, that are and will remain for a long time ideals achieved only by the relatively few.
There seemed to be a constant pressure of pronouncements, you might say, that had almost the authority of proverb.
There are not too many people who can talk about music without delivering platitudes, poetical analogies, or nonsense. He was one of the few who didn't.
He also, like I was against the attitudes of coaching, that people could be coached to do certain things.
I can't understand why so many people have never heard of him.
Hans Keller has really become one of the major influences in musical life in this country and elsewhere in the 20th century.
Throughout his life, Hans Keller pursued 3 disciplines. Music, as to be expected, but in contrast to all other writers on music, also psychology and philosophy. And as the prolific writer that he was, he wrote within them. For words to him, he said, stood in relation to the excitement of discovery. Like nicotine, and he was an inveterate smoker, they were at once a stimulant and a sedative. He didn't just have the need to communicate, but the deep-seated psychic need to communicate something true. And it was this need that made him appreciate the sanctity of individuality, part of the dignity of being human, as he put it. With heroic efforts and despite great pain, he gave an interview in support of this program. And indeed it was to be his last, for he died on November the 6th, 1985. Of this multifaceted life, he wrote, people seem to spend much of their psychological energy in not doing something. The really busy ones are capable of not doing 3 things at once. If only they realized that they could reverse the policy, they could live 3 lives like him instead of none.
By the age of 10, I knew all important string quartets and quintets, and the entire repertoire, classical repertoire, because my mother had 2 quartets at home. In addition, my mother and my father played 2 pianos and 4 hands, the entire repertoire. So by the age of 10, I knew all music.
Speaking as a teacher, I haven't encountered any music student who knows any music. They might know 1 or 2 pieces from their own repertoire, but they don't know, or shall we say, the Beethoven symphonies, let alone Brahms. They don't know music. How can you become a musician without knowing music? Now, by musician, I mean 5 things. In the first place, a musician needs music like fish need water. In the second place, a musician has to have an excellent memory musically. In the third place, he has to be creative when he plays. Performance is the tail end of composition, so he has to contribute compositorially. In the fourth place, he has to be able to listen to his partners. And in the fifth place, most importantly, he has to have rhythm. Now, by rhythm, I mean the opposite of tapping your foot. By rhythm, I mean that which one does instead of tapping one's foot. That which creates life in a musical phrase. That which establishes a tension between the implied beat and what you actually know.
Hans Keller was born in Vienna in 1919 and was a pupil of Schoenberg's best friend Oscar Adler. At the time he was due to take matriculation examinations, the Nazis invaded Austria. There was an exodus throughout that whole period of prodigious talent from Europe, and the first choice seems to have been England, although some composers, notably Schoenberg, met with such disinterest in England that eventually they ended up in America.
In 1938, I was due to take my matriculation exam. For years I had been scared of this event, as indeed had all other schoolboys, good or bad. In German-speaking countries, the matriculation was one of life's major traumas, and people had matriculation dreams right up to their death, while books were written about suicides which took place out of matriculation fear. But in March of that year, a month or two before the date of the examination, the Nazis invaded Austria. While it was, of course, carefully stage-managed, the difficult question remains how far the Austrians welcomed the Anschluss. Their enthusiasm tends to be underplayed nowadays. There had been a strong illegal Nazi party. There had been thousands, if not millions, of more passive sympathizers. I experienced various types of beatings, and what was perhaps most interesting psychologically was that in the middle of every night appeared a special SS detachment called Disposal Squad, which consisted of unpaid volunteers who went through a violent beating exercise purely for the fun of it. At the other end of psychological interest was the composure and behavior of the Orthodox Jews, of whom I was not one. We were chased through corridors with SS men with rifles on either side, who beat us with those rifles while we ran through. I bent down, covered my head with my hands, and ran through the corridor as fast as I could. The Orthodox Jews were above any such evasive action. They slowly walked through those corridors in an upright position, with the result that you couldn't identify them when they came out at the other end. But at the same time, without showing the slightest sign in their behavior of having been touched, telling each other the same Jewish jokes at the other end as they had before the operation had started. I was stunned. This was one of the deepest experiences of my life. For a long time, I thought that if one happened to survive it all, it was important to have had this experience, because otherwise one would not really be aware of what human beings were capable of. This indiscriminate, enthusiastic collective sadism. The trouble is that psychologically, this realization of the most primitive level simply does not work in the long run. Today, although I know purely intellectually what I experienced, the emotional awareness of it has been repressed. This type of repression is probably the most dangerous obstacle along the road towards an ethical improvement of society. However, my second conclusion, equally psychological, has remained a reality. The thought that if, against all realistic expectations, I was going to survive, I would never again be in a bad mood. This one, surprisingly, worked. Whenever there is motivation for a bad mood, it is enough for me to remind myself of this thought, and the attendant emotion comes back with it. The result being a grateful elation about being alive.
By utter chance, he eventually did get a passport and escaped to England, being interned for 9 months. Actually, it was Vaughan Williams who got him out. He heard him playing in a concert and immediately wrote a letter of protest to the Home Secretary. Hans Keller was released at once.
In that initial period, I played because I had to, in orchestras, which is an utterly unmusical occupation. But I needed the money. And gradually I changed over from orchestral playing and public quartet playing to writing. I had to acquire a new language, and it happened extremely gradually, that changeover, so that eventually I earned most of my money through my writing rather than playing in public.
Quartet playing in public is nowadays highly unmusical because a string quartet needs a chamber, needs the acoustics of a chamber. You are not supposed to project your sound. So I never wanted to play quartets in public. As for orchestral playing, that's highly unmusical anyway, because you can't phrase your own way, because if you are a member of a string chorus, you continually hear out-of-tune playing. 20 people don't pitch the same way. So I always used to take regiments along to rehearsals because the out-of-tune playing immediately gave me a headache.
His intention to pursue three disciplines together with specific interests in the philosophy and psychology of music brought forth a torrent of insights that lasted the rest of his life. He was the first non-medical man to contribute to the British Journal of Medical Psychology. He was music advisor to the British Film Institute, frequently writing out the scores he heard as he watched the film. He founded Music Survey with Donald Mitchell and contributed regularly to Music Review. But contributed hardly describes the depth of the contribution or exactly what he was up to. 2,000 words an article, some 15 articles a week, for over 100 different publications. But whereas other writers told you how and when, Hans Keller always told you why. The British establishment, however, thought his ideas and insights quite outrageous, whereas the American and Canadian university circuit read everything he wrote, invited him on innumerable lecture tours, and it was indeed at McMaster University in Canada that he was professor of aesthetics, not in England.
The first great Hans Keller scandal was Music Review, an article comparing Mozart and Britain. Now, it's hard for us to realize that Mozart was the not really great composer that we consider him now. Nevertheless, he was considered sufficiently great so that people thought it was absolute insanity to compare this second-rate English composer to the music of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Well, from that moment on, no matter what Hans Keller did, it was a scandal. Actually, it wasn't a scandal at all. All he was doing was saying lots of home truths. He was telling people, for instance, that Britain was a great composer. Well, they didn't think so. They were wrong. And Hans Keller had a lot of other ideas, among others Arnold Schoenberg. They said, Arnold Schoenberg, you can't listen to his music. It's hopeless. They were wrong.
My first encounter with Hans Keller was through some of his writings. When I lived in Vienna, I read some of his essays in a record magazine, and I still remember a line that he wrote on the Beethoven playing of a then celebrated string quartet: development sections are not developed, they are flushed. I happen to agree with this.
Well, nowadays,